People think cookies are just sweet treats, but they actually tell the history of the world. Every cookie has a story. Today, we're going to meet the man who is trying to share that story with all of you. Today, I'm joined by Ben Mims, a cookbook author and food writer with a passion for baking. His latest book, Crumbs, is a deep dive into the world of cookies, exploring their history, cultural significance, and what makes them such beloved treats around the world. If you're a cookie lover or just love culinary history, stick around because this episode's for you. This is Chris Spear, and you're listening to Chefs Without Restaurants, the show where I speak with culinary entrepreneurs and people working in the food and beverage industry outside of a traditional restaurant setting. I have 32 years of working in kitchens, but not restaurants, and currently operate a personal chef service, throwing dinner parties in the Washington, D.C. area. Well, I know I love a good cookie, and I'm assuming many of you do too. For this book, Ben really wanted to have as many countries around the world represented. While I don't want to use the word traditional, he did want to take a fairly classic cookie from all these countries and include it in the book. So while clearly we have like a million versions of a chocolate chip cookie here in the US, he wanted to take, one of the, if not the original chocolate chip cookie and kind of talk about its history and how it maybe came to be before, we've made a million modifications to it. So it's both a cookbook. There are recipes for all of these cookies, but it's also very much a book about the history of cookies and how they came to be. So I think it's a really interesting read. If you're someone who loves culinary history, I think you're really going to enjoy this book. Plus, it's fun to bake your way through it. I've had the book for a couple of weeks and I've already made a couple cookies with my daughter. So in the show, we talk about what he thinks a cookie is. We discuss some of the surprising stories behind some of those classic recipes, like I already mentioned, the chocolate chip cookie. And we also talk about why the history of cookies is so much more than just flour and sugar. As always, you can find all the info in the show notes as to where to pick up this book. And remember, there are only 3 episodes left until episode 250 and the end of season 5, at which point I'll be taking a little break into early 2025. Additionally, be on the lookout for my new podcast, The Personal Chef Business Startup Guide. If you'd like to know more about it, check out the previous episode of Chefs Without Restaurants. I go into all the details about that new show. You can also find me now on Instagram, additionally at Chef Startup. I'd love it if you gave me a follow. As always, thanks so much for listening and have a great week. Hey, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
Well, your new book, Crumbs, is definitely a deep dive into cookies. What made you want to go in this direction? I mean, it seems like it's a huge undertaking. Is cookies something you've always loved and been drawn to?
Yeah, cookies is something that I have been involved with my entire career. And I've written baking books and have been kind of a pastry chef in the past. I've always been in that world. And then when, the opportunity came to do a book all about cookies, I kind of realized that, every Christmas, everywhere I've ever worked, I've always been super excited about figuring out how to make cookies for, whatever place I was working for. And so it's just one of those things that I think, people always get really excited about cookies. We love all the different textures and flavors and colors, but no one had really ever delved into the history and just the stories behind cookies, really, and say why actually do these little, discs of flour and sugar? Why do they exist? What is this? Where did this come from? What was the necessity or what was the kind of reason that someone came up with them? And so I kind of wanted to go into that. And so this book is chock full of little mini histories of all the different cookies around the world. And so it kind of tells a story of, what was happening in the world that, these ingredients came about, kind of took this form and then traveled around the world, picking up different flavors and different ingredients to kind of become the, little bites of food that we have today.
Well, I don't want this to become, is a hot dog a sandwich, but what is a cookie? And maybe more importantly, what isn't a cookie to you? What is your, brief definition of what makes a cookie?
Sure. So let's see. A brief definition of a cookie is, for me, it took me months of researching to try to figure out the definition that I really wanted to come up with for what a cookie is. But I think what it boils down to, and this is, extremely long story short, is it's all about texture. So it needs to be something that is kind of crispy or chewy and kind of gives you that kind of satisfying, just like hit of sugar and particularly the chew. And then, yeah, things can be crispy, of course, too, because most of the cookies in the book are very like sandy, kind of dense, like shortbready type cookies. But I kind of started drawing the line where things became cakey. I found that, if something is kind of light and fluffy like a cake, it kind of has to have the stereotypical form of a cookie, which is to say, no more than like 2 inches in diameter, round, kind of like a hockey puck. If it becomes bigger than that, you get into things that, some people might disagree with me on, like things like French Madeleines. I think of those more as like snack cakes almost than cookies. So I did not include those in the book. There's lots of things that are considered cookies, like Polish kruszki, I think is what they're called. And those little like bow tie kind of fried pastries or fried little fritter things that people put on a cookie plate. But I'm like, well, it's deep fried. It has yeast. It's just like, it's kind of a crispy fritter. So I got really into the definitions of like, yeah, cookie versus pastry, fritter, snack cake, all these kind of, I really fried the small fish when it came to like picking over the details of what these words mean. And so I kind of came up with that definition. And then like, with ingredients, it kind of came down to, does it have not just flour, but it has some kind of like flour type element, whether that's nut based or wheat based. Does it have sugar? Does it have eggs? And then does it have fat? So and that can be butter, it can be oil, it can be ghee, anything like that. And I found that as long as whatever the cookie that I was thinking about had at least 3 of the 4, then it kind of counted. And so I think everything in the book has at least 3 of those elements, if not all 4. And so, it kind of came a little crazy and kind of maddening to try to figure it out. But I think I came to as much of a close, kind of concise definition as I could to what a cookie is to me for the book.
I did think it was interesting that you included Welsh cakes in there. And I know you talk about it in the book because my wife and I are both big fans of Wales, and we've been there twice in the past 3 years, and I love them. But I don't know that eating them, I would have called them a cookie. But I can kind of see like they're kind of borderline in my opinion.
Yeah, a lot of them came down to, culturally, is this eaten as a cookie or because of their shape? And like, yes, they have yeast sometimes, but it's not really used as a raising agent. There's a few kind of European cookies where like yeast is included, but it's not used. It's kind of just like a vestige of, a past element of it. It's not really used to give rise to anything. It's just like there. So that kind of differentiated it from becoming like a donut or any kind of like yeast raised bread type thing. And so in the Welsh cakes, they kind of have the shape of a cookie, and they're eaten. Also, in kind of another loose definition that I came up with is, anything that can be considered a cookie is kind of like a 2-biter, and it has to be eaten with your fingers or, held in your fingers. So like nothing but like a fork and plate. And so how I came up with all the cookies in the book was I kind of did an exhaustive kind of giant search with every country on earth. I made a list, and it was like 170 something, 80 something, depending on whose opinion you think of as different countries around the world. And then I kind of Googled all these countries with the word cookies, and everything that came up, I put it in a big spreadsheet. I think I got close to like 900 different cookies. And then I started culling things down. And, you kind of, from that point, you see that there are a lot of cookies, obviously, in like the US, Western Europe, places where cookies are much more of a cultural thing. And so I started narrowing things down from there. And so in other parts of the world, I had to kind of not break my definition, but loosen the parameters for what I would include, because I really wanted all the cookies in the book to be things that had a history of being made at home. So no like kind of factory made cookies or industrial stuff. So like no Oreos, things like that. But in other parts of the world, let's say like Southeast Asia or like Sub-Saharan Africa, like they're not really making cookies in the same way as like, in Germany. And so a lot of it came down to like who has ovens and who doesn't. And, a lot of things come down to colonialism and the kind of influence of where the cookies came from before they came to other parts of the world. And so I kind of had to narrow down and kind of use different definitions of what I thought a cookie would be. So a lot of the ones in like Southeast Asia and Africa too kind of started as maybe if they weren't made at home, they were made in like bakeries in town. So it was kind of homemade at a bakery in the cities or different towns where they came from. And they became these things that people now make at home. But at least none of them were ever factory made. So it was always like, okay, at least made in the home or baked in like a local bakery type thing. And a lot of those in Europe, Western Europe, came in the same way as well. So the Welsh cakes too, when I was trying to flesh out the UK section of the book, a lot of the cookies in the UK that are very popular are like industrial factory made cookies. So like there's not a huge history of making them at home. And so I kind of had to loosen my definition of what these things would be. And I really wanted to include, cookies from every kind of like part of the world. And so the Welsh cakes too was one that I had made years prior for Food Network and had been introduced to. And I was like, oh, I see. And it kind of was the one that made me think about cookies in a different context and not just in the American way or just the kind of stereotypical like Western European way. So I wanted to include those, and I think they do fit the bill and I like them a lot. So, oh, and the Welsh cakes, they are, I think what helped kind of define it for me was anything like that, which is kind of like a batter or it's cooked or it's a dough. And then it's like kind of, it's round, sure. But then if it's coated in sugar afterwards, that's where the sugar element came in and made it feel more like a cookie versus, a bread or any like a pancake or anything like that. And so, kind of coating them in sugar kind of transformed this kind of like doughy puck into kind of like a cookie like treat. So that's my extremely long way of telling you why I included the Welsh griddle cakes in the book. Yes.
Well, I mean, I can see that. And I do love them. So I'm glad there's a recipe. How did you figure out or decide on I guess for your book, the definitive version, right? Because just something like a chocolate chip cookie in the US, there's, probably hundreds of them. So you want to put together the best representation of all these different types of cookies. Are you just reading like dozens of recipes and pulling them together and trying different batches of, say, a chocolate chip cookie or whatever? And then, what was that process like?
It was both really easy and kind of difficult to come up with these kind of like definitive recipes for the book. And I hesitate to use the word definitive too. I kind of have been telling people that the book is more just like, here is the kind of like prototype blank slate recipe for all these cookies, kind of just like where they started. It's almost on purpose to be just starting at 101 basic. And if you then once you see what this cookie was originally intended to be like or to taste like or have the texture of, if you then want to make it your own or try to, quote unquote, improve it by 2024 standards, then go ahead. But I wanted to give people like, here's the starting point. And so a lot of the cookies in the book, actually all of them, yeah, you're right. I literally either looked at every single recipe I could find online, mostly in cookbooks though, because, I'm a firm believer that, research cookbooks are better sources than, anything you can just like find online. But it also depended on the cookies because, chocolate chip cookie, for example, yes, there's like millions and millions and millions of recipes. So I was like, it's kind of not even worth my time to look at every single chocolate chip cookie. It's almost like, okay, where did this thing start from and why? So it made sense in this context to go back to the original, Ruth Wakefield Nestle or Toll House chocolate chip cookie and kind of like almost reintroduce people to, here's what this thing started out as and here's why it came about, and get to know the original, because there's so many recipes now where it's just like, we're browning the butter and we're adding gold leaf and we're just like doing all these crazy things. And it's like, let's get back to what it was. And what it originally was kind of like a hermit cookie, which was also in the book. It's like a brown sugar cookie that used walnuts and raisins, kind of like a dried fruit catch-all. And so, and I've read every single history about it. And, a little bit of the book is kind of like not making up, but kind of like guessing at what was going on in Ruth's mind when she came up with the chocolate chip cookie. And, the cookie outside of the chocolate for all intents and purposes, looks exactly like these hermit cookies that have been around for a long time. So it is, within my reasonable estimation that she was making these cookies, did not have raisins, and then decided to add some, chopped bars of chocolate that was kind of like a recent, invention in the world at the time, because the original chocolate chip cookie does have walnuts as well. And the dough is exactly like these other hermit cookies. So I kind of want it, and in the recipe for the original chocolate chip cookie, she uses 14 ounces of chopped bar chocolate, whereas now, if you get the package of Nestle, chocolate chips, it's 12 ounces, and so there's like 2 ounces of chocolate missing. She also like dissolves the baking soda in warm water before she adds it to the dough, which that doesn't happen.
I want to stay there for a second because that was something I was going to ask you. I've never seen that in any cookie recipe, let alone any recipe anywhere for cakes or anything.
Yeah.
I'm always just throwing baking soda in with the flour mix. Have you seen that as something in your reading of recipes, not even just for cookies, but anything? Because I've never seen any recipe that calls for that. And what's that about?
I have, because I'm from the South, and so I don't know if it's like a Southern like layer cake thing, but like my grandmother, she kept like extensive recipes of all like her Southern like layer cakes, and there are lots of um layer cakes that I never found it in cookies before now, but I always found it in like cake recipes where people would dissolve baking soda in warm water. I never actually really looked into like why people do that. I assume it's just because, a lot of times when you have something that has too much like kind of baking soda, baking powder, it can kind of, you have that metallic taste to it. So I assume that maybe it was because they felt like they needed to dissolve this, the baking soda in water to help it disperse better. And I have found that cakes that are made with this kind of dissolved baking soda, they flatten out better and they kind of rise more evenly. So I think maybe that's what that was about, was just to kind of disperse the baking soda better, because it needs to react with moisture. So if it's in water already and then gets mixed in, it's kind of more evenly dispersed in the dough. So I think that's probably where that came from. I assume is just this habit of dissolving baking soda in water, and then somewhere along the way we decided, we can just add it straight to the flour. We don't need to dissolve it in water. That's an extra step. But I thought that was such a fun, like kind of unique little detail that needed to be added in, and then people could decide whether that's important for them to leave in or not. But yeah, it's something that's just like, it's kind of like a relic from the past and the way people used to make things, that for me is super interesting. And that's the kind of things I wanted to focus on more than here's a new flavor or here's a whatever. I want to be like, what was happening in 1930s that in the culture of making cookies and cakes and things, that these kind of details that made it into these cookies. So I find stuff like that super fascinating.
Yeah, I do too, which is why it caught my eye. Looking at a book like this, I wouldn't even necessarily go to a chocolate chip cookie recipe because, it's one that I know really well. So I was looking at the different ones, but I did look and it jumped out at me. I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I like that stuff too, picking up the little details and trying to, figure out what's going on there. So you're obviously digging into the history of these cookies. Was there any that you found interesting, like a story behind the cookie that you didn't know, or that you just like really loved learning as you were going through this process?
That's a great question. There were lots of cookies where, that I had, never even heard of myself. And then I kind of delved into their history and I was like, oh, this is, how wild. But there's two cookies in the book that are named for presidents of their respective countries. One is in Iceland. The other one I'm forgetting right at the moment, but it was, I think, Iceland, because it was their first female president. And so and these cookies were a favorite of hers. So they kind of, whatever the name of the cookie was before then, they just changed it to kind of be her last name, and kind of, and that's what it ended up being in the book. And so I found that was like super fascinating, how things like that kind of become part of the culture. And even in more like recent times, I think that was, after 1900. There were lots of cookies that, I had, some lots of conversations with my publisher about, because the book kind of highlighted a lot of, a colonial past in this world, of course, of, Spain and Portugal and everywhere in Europe, kind of taking their food culture around the world during colonial times. There are lots of cookies that kind of have maybe less than lovely names and associations with them, and so we had to kind of talk about like, these are the names and these kind of colloquial terms that people used back then, and like, they're either seen as, from, the best outcome is that they are kind of slightly off color to now they're like offensive. And so a lot of them have been changed, thankfully, over the years, but some kind of remain. And so I was like, we discussed a lot about like just the history and like, should we address these things? Should we not? Like, what's the important parts to keep in and let people know, like, this is, yes, it's about cookies, but it's also about the history of the world. And it's about, how things happened at that time. So there were lots of interesting stories behind cookies like that were just like, wow, even cookies have, a dark past sometimes. But in these things that, we think of as just all happy and sugar and, butter, but they can be dark as well sometimes. I think a huge part of the book that I kind of took joy in uncovering were the real reasons that some cookies have names that they do. I love a good old folk tale, but I also get really frustrated when we spend, decades of our life trying to figure out, how did a snickerdoodle have that name? And it's like people just coming up with like really kind of asinine reasons and stories and kind of making up urban legends, which are all fun to talk about. But I'm like, I actually really care what the real reason was. And so with snickerdoodles, I did like a lot of research into German immigrants at the time coming over and like what was happening when these cookies kind of came about. And there was the Schnecken noodle, which is like basically a cinnamon roll that came over from Germany back in, I think the late 1800s. And so to me, I was like, okay, clearly the snickerdoodle cookie comes from this. So let me figure out what happened and where it got lost in translation along the way. And so there were lots of these kind of instances at that time where cinnamon and these kind of different flavors were being used into everything, because it was kind of like not a new ingredient, of course, but just like a trendy ingredient to be used. And so to me, it kind of showed that, okay, anything, this new food, this cinnamon roll type thing called Schneckennoodle that's in the US, it's like it is today. Any kind of new thing comes over, people start riffing on it, and they kind of start making everything kind of new that they're making with it kind of revert back to that old name. And so I can see someone saying like, oh, I'm going to make, cinnamon sugar, let's say cake, balls in the 1800s. And I'm going to call it, Schnecken noodle or something. And so the name kind of just gets repeated and filtered down over the decades and in centuries until it just kind of becomes something a little bit easier to say for English speaking Americans. And so that to me kind of showed where this cookie came from and, why it has that weird name that we think of as coming from somewhere else, but it's really just an easier way to say a really hard German word. So that was, and there were lots of those like that, where it was just the names of the cookies, I think just started out, especially in America, as these kind of more difficult to pronounce European words that just, people wanted to say them easier here. So they kind of got watered down until they became these kind of fantastical sounding terms that really have, they don't have any urban legends, but we like to make them up for them. So that was really fun to kind of uncover and get to the truth on.
Yeah, I've seen in your book you have, some of them have like the, I guess, American type name and then the original underneath or something.
Yeah.
So are you someone who tries to find like used bookstores and just go through shelves and pull random or obscure books to kind of find these recipes? If you're not using the internet as much as cookbooks, how challenging was it to find like original, traditional, authentic cookbooks from some of these more, I guess, harder to find countries? Like, I don't know if I could find like a Estonian cookbook or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'd honestly be surprised, because I would, I also did like a search for, every country with the word cookbook afterward to see like what else existed out there. I honestly, from working in the food industry for the past, over 15 years, I had amassed a good collection of cookbooks that, thank God, I had held on to for so long, that had a lot of this information in them. But I also, I bought a lot of new books during the research of this. I also went to the library here in LA to do a lot of research. And then I found out, kind of like after 2 months of going to the library, that you can check out and search for all of their books online, even with your library card. So I was like, oh, I could just like do this from my computer online. So that was a huge thing. And so I was able to kind of like at least do all the hard part of searching for all the books, and then go and then like sit through and read them. And it's also one of those things where, yes, you can do a lot of research online. And I did for a lot of places, that a lot of countries that maybe don't have a history of, recording their recipes. Many countries around the world have like one cookbook that was like, had all their recipes in them. And so everything else really does exist online. And a lot of it is like people from those countries who have like moved to like the US or the UK, and they started blogs and things like that. And so it really was, relying on so many different types of sources to get this information. But there's a lot to be said for going to a library. I know this makes me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but going to a library, checking out a book, and just kind of, because I found so many things by just reading through books I probably would not have picked up if I was just like trying to search for them online, because you spend time just like looking at the different spines of the books, and you're like, oh, this might have something in it. And then you open it up and it does. And so being able to just like have the time to just spend in a library and like kind of let your eye kind of wander, let the information kind of take you different places. I uncovered a lot of just information that I don't think I would have found if I had just been searching online, even within the, library archives for, specific key terms and things like that. So a lot of books that I found online, which is very good, which I didn't realize was such a good resource. There's so many, older books from like back in the 1500s and things that are available online that people have scanned for like Google Books and things. So I was able to kind of search through a lot of books that aren't even in libraries, that are only available online, to kind of read through those. And my God, I spent a lot of time with Google Translate.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, because I imagine a lot of those books are not in English.
Yes. So many books were not in English, and it was so, I think by the end of it, I was actually really good at reading German, just from having to like, or at least the German words for like flour and butter and sugar and all that kind of stuff. And so, I spent a lot of time with my Google Translate phone held up to like the computer screen or a book, and kind of like taking snapshots and seeing ingredients. And that was really fascinating, because I think outside of modern cookbook times, which I will say, from maybe the 60s, 70s on, every recipe for a lot of these older cookies was kind of the same. Like every single recipe for, let's say, a German cookie would always be the exact same amount of flour, the exact same amount of butter and sugar. And it was just like, maybe the flavorings would vary slightly, but like there was not really innovations when it came to like changing the texture. Like people found that this was the thing that worked, let's stick with it. And so it made it quite easy to kind of come up with the quote unquote definitive, or the kind of base recipes for these books, because not much had changed until kind of our more recent 50 years ago modern times, where we started playing around with different textures that were good to try to make them better, and then either succeeded or failed. And so a lot of them were like, these are just like classic forms of how these things work, stick with it, and here's this thing where it came from. So that actually made it quite easy to find a lot of those old recipes and be kind of feel good about the fact that, okay, these have been here. These have obviously been around for centuries because they work in this way. This is how, I know this would be the recipe to include in the book.
Yeah, it's kind of nice that way. I had a customer I did a dinner for a couple weeks ago, and instead of my normal desserts, he wanted me to recreate his grandmother's. They're not cookies, but they're peanut butter balls, and it's like, peanut butter with Rice Krispies and coated in chocolate. And he sent me a photo of her recipe card, and I couldn't read everything. And I just went online and Googled it, and it's literally the same recipe that like 400 people have used. And I was just like, okay, like I just, because the chef in me, I was like, I want to make sure that this is going to work because I've never made this before. And it was good to just know
Yeah.
that this is like a very basic recipe that like everyone knows how to make. The only change I did is I just couldn't bring myself to buying margarine, and I had to use butter for
Sure.
it because
Yeah.
I was like, no, we're not doing that. But yeah, some of those things, I mean, it's like all the recipes I grew up with my mom made, most of them just came off of a box of something or out of the newspaper. It's the same
Exactly.
thing that everyone around the country used. You had talked about, like things coming over from other places. And, one of the things that I, in the book, I saw you have a recipe for Benny wafers, and it calls for sesame.
Mhm.
I totally get why you do it, but there is a little difference between like true Benny
Sure.
and sesame. And have you made these with like, say, an Anson Mills, like true Benny, as opposed to like a sesame seed that you could find in every grocery store?
You know what? I haven't. I know that Anson Mills has those, and I have not. I've not made these cookies with that. I wanted to, at least with all the cookies in the book, especially in instances like that, I wanted them to also be, as makeable by everyone as possible. So like, even if, because this book is also, yes, I develop it. I'm an American, but it's sold internationally. It's going to be kind of like all over the world. And so I wanted everyone to be able to make it no matter where they are. And so I did, like in one of these instances, and also sesame seeds were just, being used in so much of the book as well, in like a lot of North Africa, the Mediterranean, cookies as well, of course. And so I kind of wanted the cookies to be made by the most people as possible. So, yeah, the Benny wafers, are it's slightly different than using sesame seeds. But, growing up too, we also use sesame seeds a lot. And I know a lot of people who just use sesame seeds because it was the easiest thing. And so I figured, this is something where the actual ingredient is so hard to find outside of the specific region it comes from. And so this will be a fine substitution or thing to use because also people have been using sesame seeds. But I agree with you.
I have relatives down in South Carolina, and probably the first, 20 years of going down there, I mean, everyone's using sesame seeds, right? Like when you buy those bags at the market, they're all sesame seeds. I was just curious because I've started, picking up more stuff from Anson Mills and having it sent to my house. And I thought that's something that I've never really worked with, and I was going to pick some up. And I don't know how it changes, if at all, in the recipe, but I think I might give that a try.
Yeah, I bet there are subtle changes that are actually, would make take the cookie from, an 8.5 to a 10 for sure. And it's one of those things where there are a lot of details like that I really wanted to keep in, the book and kind of tell those stories. But at the end of the day, I was like, okay, this is a cookie book. It's not a, it's not a Benny history, or it's not a, cardamom history. It's like, I got to keep it on theme here. So, but I think, another time and place, or if there was, less recipes, if it was only like an American cookies book, where I kind of stretched out the whole American chapter to an entire book length, then that would have given room to kind of dig in more to specific ingredients, and also like get into like, oatmeal raisin cookies, and like, the chocolate for the chocolate chip cookie, and kind of like dig into the sugar for the sugar cookies, and like how these things kind of change. So there was, I did that a few times in the book. Each chapter has like an essay where it's kind of like breaking out a kind of cultural through line that I wanted to explore within each section or kind of part of the book. And that was my way to kind of get in a little more context and a little more history into the cookies I couldn't fit into each head note. But yeah, in a different book, I would definitely delve into more of those individual ingredient histories far more.
I just find this so fascinating. There's so many interesting things in there. There was a cookie with mayonnaise in it, which at first I was like, that sounds kind of gross. But then you just think about it, and you're like, oh, that makes sense. It's eggs and oil. Yeah. Have you seen that in multiple cookies, or was it just I think I only saw it in one of the cookies in the cookbook. Is that something you've encountered anywhere else with the cookie process?
Again, I'm going to take it back to Southern layer cakes, because I did growing up. I have seen everything from mayonnaise to there's an old recipe for a Campbell's like tomato soup cake, where you literally pour a can of tomato soup into like a chocolate cake. And oddly, it tastes great. That you don't taste the tomato soup at all because it's just so much sugar. And that kind of savory tomato is kind of like masked with cocoa powder, blah, blah, blah. But again, not necessarily the same quality as using fresh eggs and oil, but it is a very smart kind of cheat. if you don't have those ingredients, and if you only have, shelf stable resources, like I think that cookie came from Estonia, one of the former USSR countries. It's, if you have no fresh ingredients, then the mayonnaise is there, and that kind of is 2 for 1. So I kind of found that very fascinating.
I do too. And I hope that's one of the things that people enjoy about this book. You're a food writer, and we're still in that time where people on the internet complain about like food blogs, like, I don't need your story, just give me the recipe, right? But
Yeah.
I think what makes for me a good cookbook is something that has some story, that has some history, a little background. I'm not looking just to get a book with 100 recipes in it with no historical context. I really love that. And I think that's something that stands out about this book, especially if you're a cookie lover. But it does give you such a insight into so many of these countries, and, what, how these things came about, other than just, it's something delicious and sweet to eat.
Yeah. And, again, maybe this is, why I'm not more popular than I should be, but I am much more concerned about the history and the story than I am about just like a new flavor for a new flavor's sake. And I actually found, when I was doing a lot of research for the book, there were lots of, these other cookbooks written by other very famous, very well-regarded people who they don't really give any history or context into any of the cookies at all. It's more just like they either talk about these urban legends a little bit, or it's just all about flavor. So it's kind of just, looking into these histories was kind of an undertaking. And so having to do that, I see how a lot of people are just like, I'm just going to focus on, creating a new texture and a new flavor. And that's what I'm going to write my head note about. That's what I'm going to kind of focus on, because figuring out the story behind it is like, it is very, it's hard to find. You have to do a lot of research, as I found out, to kind of get to where these things came from or how they came about. And so it's just kind of easier to not focus on it. And so I kind of had to do a lot of the hard work to kind of figure out those things on my own, because a lot of texts that came before really didn't have that information. But that to me is what's, kind of the point to writing a book and writing and kind of learning about these things, is to kind of get the entire 360 history of what's going on, and not just focus on the flavor, unless, a flavor element is what made it so distinct, or kind of what made it so special to begin with. And so that to me was a really fascinating thing about finding out all the details and the histories of these cookies. And, like with the blog stuff too, I understand when people are like, oh, I don't want the history or the story, just give me the cookie or give me the recipe. I think a lot of times, and, I've been the same way, where it's like, when I was, reading a lot of these blogs for these cookie recipes, I think a lot of times people who write blogs and stuff like that, obviously they're having to write a lot, but, to get paid online for their stories and things. I think if cookbook authors, I think if everyone focused on telling maybe better stories, and not just kind of rote, formulaic, okay,
Keyword
here's this thing
stuffing.
just to fill time. Yes, keyword stuffing. Then I think people would not have that same outlook on it, because I found, and a lot of the cookies I came across in certain blogs where, there's no cookbook culture with these certain countries, but this person wrote a blog about this cookie. I read a lot of their stuff, and it actually had good information that I needed to know to make sense of why the cookie was like the way it was, because I was reading about it. And so I think if you had just missed over that, then you'd be like, why is this cookie special? I'm not going to make this. And so sometimes it is worth reading it, but it needs to be information that is pertinent. And I think, they have a service, but I tried to focus on, okay, what is the information in the book or about each cookie that is the most important to know? And I just focused on that, because I understand that a lot of people just want, new cookie recipes, and that's great. But there's also a million books out there that already provide that information. And so my thing was, if you're someone who cares about the history, if you care about where things came from, and you really want to like get into that, and I think more people are into it than they think, they just have never been presented that information in this way, then I think that they'll be excited to learn more about it, instead of just thinking of food and cookies as just this kind of thing that, they don't really give much more consideration to than, what they're putting on, what clothes they're wearing. And so I kind of want to spark a more interesting dialogue about getting to know the food that we consume every day and where it comes from and why, because it all matters when it comes to why we make it for certain holidays, why we share it with people, and maybe that will kind of, yeah, again, inspire people to kind of make different things, try new things, and kind of expand their knowledge of what a cookie can be.
Well, since you mentioned holidays, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we're in summer, but I feel
Yeah.
like holiday season is going to roll up on us. Cookie exchanges, everyone does them every year, right? And I feel like I get the same things. We make the same things. What would you recommend? Someone this year has a cookie exchange, and they 1 to 3 different types of cookies. What do you think would be really fun and interesting that maybe when you went to a cookie exchange, people would say, "Wow, I've never had this before," and it was something delicious. Any thoughts on that?
Great question. Yes. So one of my favorite things about the book, and I kind of wrote a little essay about it, but I wish I had kind of, I mean, there's kind of not really a way to talk about it without sounding too granular, but all of the gingerbread type cookies in Eastern and Western Europe, I found super fascinating because they all, yes, they're similar, but they're kind of not. Like some are really thin and brittle, some are much thicker and kind of cakier, some are kind of like pressed into like a stamp mold, and some use, crushed spices versus, completely ground ones. But all the different gingerbreads around Europe, and some that wound up in, let's say, Mexico or South Africa and all these other kind of places, they use slightly different spices in different amounts. And so I kind of had this idea to create little, spice bundles that kind of like, here's the Finnish gingerbread spice mix, here's the German one, here's the Estonian one, here's the Icelandic one, and kind of like show how different spices and different flavorings kind of made their way into this quote unquote gingerbread archetype of cookie. And so I think for the holidays, that'd be a really fun thing to do. It would be to either make all the gingerbread type cookies from, let's say, 5 to 6 different European countries to kind of show side by side how varying levels of clove or ginger or cinnamon can like impact the flavor and like what the difference is. That's something that I probably am going to do myself just because I think
I
it's
love
super
it.
fascinating to kind of show everyone, literally like put the country like on a piece of paper on a map or something of its country and kind of like show how the texture changes, the shape, the all the spices and things. And then if you don't want to do all that, then my favorite cookie, or one of my favorite cookies in the book, is the Dutch, Belgian, Northern German speculoos cookies, of course, which everyone kind of knows, but not really. And they are used by pressing the dough into kind of like a wooden mold. And then you kind of like bang the mold out to get the cookies out. And people have seen them maybe. They have like a Dutch windmill pattern sometimes, or they have like a Santa Claus pattern or different like kind of pagan animals and folklore and stuff like that. And so I think those are really cool just because of, not so many cookies, at least in America, ever these days, I can think of off the top of my head, use a mold like that anymore. Like we use cookie cutters, of course, but not in these kind of like old wooden molds that you can find online for cheap, or you can get like, vintage ones for, hundreds of dollars that have been passed around through the centuries. So I think kind of making more sculpted, molded, crafted cookies to me is really fun rather than just, the usual brown ball with a Hershey Kiss in the top. So yeah, it
It's a
just
little
kind of
more work.
expands. It's a little more work, but also it's more fun and you can like decorate them more and you can just also those cookies like that, like they do the mold and all the stuff, they do all the hard work for you. So you don't have to shape anything. You just kind of press it in and bang out and you have this super intricate, beautiful cookie that you can show off and people think hand carved it. And it's like, no, you just use the mold. So I think that's easier than having to, hand shape and twist into candy cane shapes, all these other different things that we use for Christmas. So kind of getting back to the pagan Christmas time, pagan holiday molds and shapes, I think I love that would be fun to do.
My all-time favorite is a molasses cookie. It's something my mom used to
Mm.
make, and for me, it's the texture, like getting the right texture of I like it a little. I don't like a. I mean, I like a ginger snap, but I want it to be like a little chewy. And I've been working on a signature cookie, and what I'm kind of doing now is I do a molasses, but I put masa in there, and I use like Hacienda's masa harina in there, and it took a lot of noodling with to find the texture right, so it wasn't too dense, and also this really meticulous. Like my wife's like, just cook them like a normal person, but it's like no, it's like 6.5 minutes, and then you have to rotate it and do another 6.5, and then they have to sit for exactly 1 minute on the pan, and then they have to go on a rack. But I've been playing with that a lot, and I finally got it to a place. I'm from New England, so for me, we love all the molasses and stuff. And I don't know if you've ever had Indian pudding. Do you know Indian pudding?
Oh yes.
Yeah, so that's like my favorite. So this cookie was kind of inspired by that, like taking my love of that, but it's a pudding that has cornmeal, and I'm like, okay, well, cornmeal sounds cool, but I'm also a big fan of Mexican cooking and working that in there. And I'd never seen an instance where there was like masa in a molasses type cookie. I've seen, I think at least one of your recipes. I know somewhere I saw that there was masa harina in it, masa harina, whatever. But yeah, I'd never seen it in like a molasses type cookie before, so that's kind of my signature. So that'll probably be on my holiday plate this year. But I love the idea of then showcasing other molasses gingerbread type cookies with that.
Oh yeah, and the kind of section of molasses cookies, which kind of stemmed from the gingerbread cookies of like Europe and kind of went to the UK and then the US, I found was super fascinating as well to see how this byproduct of sugar making that is similar to, but not at all like all the sugar syrups of Europe, kind of came into a cookie and then kind of created a completely different cookie that has a completely different texture. It makes it chewy. It makes it kind of, the bitterness of molasses is completely different than like, the caramel syrups of Scandinavia and like Western Europe, which just provide this kind of caramelly sweetness, whereas molasses is super bitter and kind of plays off the spices even better and gives it that chew that the European cookies don't have. And so, yeah, there's the first probably 4 or 5 cookies in the North America chapter are the kind of Canadian and like New England molasses cookies, and kind of shows the different ways you can play with texture and molasses to kind of make something, like a ginger snap or a chewy ginger cookie, or, kind of, the Joe Frogger cookie, which is like from New England, is kind of just like a big molasses pancake almost. It kind of became cookie over time. And so there's a cookie in Spain that uses molasses as well, which is, I found so fascinating to find. I think it's in one of the islands off the coast of Spain where they actually have sugarcane was growing there, and they kind of made like actual real molasses that we use in America there. And so that was a very unique thing for European cookies. And so to kind of get into all the different ways in which molasses as an ingredient has kind of changed the cookies around the world, I thought was super fascinating, because I did a kind of mini essay about sugar syrups, quote unquote, and how they started as these kind of like caramelized things in Europe and then moved to molasses in the Americas. And that just kind of shows how, one idea for a cookie, when used for something, a different ingredient that looks similar and should act the same, actually completely changed the cookie and kind of made a completely new genre and style that, has stuck around to this day. So that was super fascinating. And molasses is kind of the secret ingredient, kind of change agent of so many cookies in the past like 200 years.
I love that stuff, but I think my kids wish I would stop like putting molasses in desserts. They're like, just a chocolate chip cookie. This is like, I don't know. It's like, as I get into middle age, it's like, is this like an old man? Like, am I turning into my dad? Like my dad, like old New England, or like molasses cookies, Indian pudding, grape nut pudding. I'm like, oh, all that stuff my dad liked, I actually really love now, but is that like old man dessert? I don't know.
I think it's just less sweet. And I think as we get older, we want less sugar. So that works. Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of listeners who really are interested in recipe development and cookbook type stuff. Do you have any advice for someone who maybe wants to go into that line of work, like doing professional recipe development and maybe even writing a cookbook?
Wow. Sure. I think my main takeaway, which I always tell people, and I kind of see the light dim from their eyes, is that you're not going to make any money. So it's kind of like a passion project, I would say. Most cookbooks, like it's something that you do because you really just have an idea and you want that information out there, and you you love doing it, and it's like, yeah, it's something you do on the side. It's never going to be a money-making endeavor. So I think as long as you are approaching it from like, this is my passion, I have to get this work out no matter what, then I think, like with any book, it's just like, here's an idea that I have, here's a story I have to tell, here is my perspective that I need for it to be out in the world, because I think it will add to the culture, add to the conversation. I think if that is where you're starting from, then you're good. And I would say pursue it. And I think also, if you come from that mindset, then doing all the work on the front end that you need to do, like writing a proposal and kind of like sending it out to people to try to see if anyone wants to publish the book and do that whole thing, that part won't be so hard, because you will be coming from this perspective of, I believe in this, I need to get it out, I'm going to do whatever it takes to do it. Yeah. And then I think just having a unique thing to say. I always tell people the more niche a idea is, the better, because so much in our world has been done already. So it's like, what are you adding to the conversation? So I think that, for me, particularly a cookbook, let's say, that is all recipes that you can take with you to go on a hike or something, like, or that you can take with you to eat on a boat. Like, just something that's like super like, wow, this is such a specific instance, such a specific set of parameters to get through. That to me is more interesting than like, here's 100 just like weeknight recipes that I like, or here's 100 chicken recipes. Like, I think try to come up with something novel, something new, and something super specific that only you could write. I think if it's an idea that you think already exists out there that anybody could do it, then that's not the one to do. But, if you wanted to write a book all about molasses puddings around the world, or molasses puddings in New England, that to me is super fascinating. I want to read that.
Great. I'm going to start working on that one when we get off.
Please do. Please do. I'll buy the first copy.
Well, I think that's great advice. And yeah, to our listeners, is like, there's no money in podcasting either. Feel free to Venmo me some money if you guys are loving the show. But yeah, I as someone who has a podcast, I get a lot of people who want to come on the show and talk about books. And I've seen a lot of books, and you're just like, wow, it's just like you have a recipe for a Caesar salad, and you have a recipe for an omelet or whatever. It's like, I don't know. I feel like I've seen this recipe 80 times. Like, I mean, yeah. I guess if you're a famous YouTuber or something, no shade, but kind of a little, yes. What's the point? Like, why? Like, if you're just trying to, grow your brand, fine, I guess. But there's so many of those books out there that just, they don't seem interesting to me.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where those recipes work, is if you are someone famous or someone well-known who you just want to keep giving people another book to buy, then a Caesar salad is great. But otherwise, it's like, that story has been told. Let's come up with something new and interesting to kind of push things forward. And I think if you really are passionate about, that, then come up with, a book that is 100 Caesar salads and getting into all the different ways you can make things better, which to me would be at least more interesting than just, another one under a celebrity cookbook, So yeah, believe in the idea and you'll be good.
Yeah. Cheers to that. Well, I always put everything in the show notes, or links to the book and your social media and everything. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to leave our listeners with before we get out of here today?
I think the thing that I would want to leave listeners with is just, to be curious. That's always been my kind of driving force in all the work I do and all the books I write, is just being curious. Like, if you come across a detail or something and you're just like, why is this being used? Is the batter for this cookie mixed this way? Why use that amount of, sugar versus this? Why is this shaped this way? Just always be curious, because I think it's always something to come from that, whether it is a history of shaping things a certain way, how an ingredient was made. And like, for me, I find all those kind of, pun intended, kind of like granular details to be really fascinating, and it can always kind of tell you something more that you didn't know. And so that's what I hope to do with this book, is kind of give people that outlet to be like, oh yeah, this little thing that I think doesn't really matter at all, I've never even thought about, there actually is some history here, there actually is like a point to it. So yeah, just be more curious. And I hope that Crumbs kind of like inspires people to be more curious about all the food they eat, even if it's just starting at cookies and things like that.
Well, again, having seen the book, I think you've accomplished that, and I hope people love it. It's a really great read besides just being a collection of cookie recipes. Well, thanks for coming on the show, and to all of our listeners, as always, this has been Chris with Chefs Without Restaurants. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week. You're still here? The podcast's over. If you are indeed still here, thanks for taking the time to listen to the show. I'd love to direct you to one place, and that's chefswithoutrestaurants.org. From there, you'll be able to join our email newsletter, get connected in our free Facebook group, and join our personal chef, catering, and food truck database so I can help get you more job leads. And you'll also find a link to our sponsor page, where you'll find products and services I love. You pay nothing additional to use these links, but I may get a small commission, which helps keep the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast and organization running. You might even get a discount for using some of these links. As always, you can reach out to me on Instagram at Chefs Without Restaurants or send me an email at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. Thanks so much.